So I just got back from the store. I went and got a gallon of milk for Shauna, and I was looking, there was no milk on the shelves, and it kind of reminded me of the November FAO food report from the UN, and I don't know if you guys read that, but it showed an increase in our food price index of 10% year over year, almost 3% just from October alone. And dairy was way up there. It was heading up. I mean, dairy just looks like it's on a straight line up right now. So does meat and vegetable oils. But seeing the lack of dairy on the shelves, and there's not even a winter storm coming, it got me thinking about it, because it's true that these prices are on the rise, and yet so many dairy farmers around the world are going bankrupt. You can tell it's been a while since I've used this thing. It's been sitting underneath the house. I didn't think it was getting that much moisture on it, but it's not a super expensive saw, so it doesn't surprise me that it's rusted up a little bit. Anyway, the food price index was a bit concerning to me, and the reason why it was concerning is because it showed an increase in meat and it showed an increase in vegetable oils, but it didn't show that much of an increase in grains yet. It did mention that they felt that a strong increase in grains was coming, but the reason for the increase in vegetable oils largely had to do with, as they said, the increased production of biofuels. But as we know, palm oil in Malaysia has suffered quite a bit this year just in the production of it, as well as some other vegetable oil crops. Soybeans have suffered. I mean, we've had a really bad year. We talk about corn, we talk about soybeans, we talk about all these crops here, but what we haven't really talked about are some of those vegetable oil crops. Palm oil has gone up 26% in the last 2 months. That's insane. Soya oil has gone way up in December, and so has mustard. Mustard's gone way up in December. Anyway, so we've talked a lot about grains and stuff, but these vegetable oils have also suffered a really, really tough growing season. And because of that, and the combination of biofuels, we're really kind of running low on supplies there. So that is the big issue, is just the supplies aren't there. There's actually a crisis going on right now with vegetable oil. And vegetable oil is a commodity. It's used in so many different food products that it's really kind of a big problem. And with biofuel usage and the increase of biofuels, it's just making that supply glut even worse. So either we have a good growing season next year, or we can expect vegetable oils to be one of the more expensive commodities in the near future. I think that vegetable oils right now are catching up to grains, but the grains have also been highly manipulated. All over the world, corn is in high demand. The only reason why the U.S. corn is as low as it is through price manipulation. And I'm going to get to why you would want to keep, the price of these commodities as low as possible in a minute. But meat is the other one. I don't think that meat has even reached its peak. Something you have to remember is that African swine fever, which was kind of the base of the reason why part of the meat's been going up so much, is because the African swine fever has caused us to cull a ton of pigs. It's still spreading. It's spreading into Europe in some areas, and even here in the U.S., we've really picked up security measures to try and keep it from coming here.
Hello, I'm Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue, and today I'd like to talk to you about something that threatens our pork industry, a devastating disease called African swine fever that is spreading around the world right now and affects both domestic and wild pigs. To be clear, it does not affect people, nor is it a food safety issue. Most importantly, African swine fever has never been detected in the United States. However, it is a very real threat. Hey, Doc. We want everyone who comes into contact with pigs, from the large farm owner to owners of a single teacup pig, and even international travelers and petting zoo visitors, to understand how easily this disease can spread and the importance of keeping our U.S. pigs free from this disease. We're doing our part at USDA to help prevent this by restricting imports of pork and pork products from affected countries, and also by working to raise awareness about the signs and symptoms of African swine fever and how people can report sick pigs. We're also working with U.S. Customs and Border Protection to increase screening of passengers and baggage coming into the U.S. from affected areas, as international travelers may unknowingly carry the disease back into the United States on their clothing or shoes.
But it almost seems like the spread of African swine fever is inevitable. There is no vaccine for it. I mean, it could come in on anything. They're using dogs at the airports and at the ports along the U.S. coast to try and sniff out any pork products before they come into the country. This virus can come in on somebody's clothing. I mean, it's just a very nasty thing, and it's eventually going to come into the U.S. I don't see how they can prevent it, just watching it continue to spread throughout the world. And so we are going to see a huge number of pigs slaughtered, but that meat is still edible. It's not poisonous. It's not a disease that affects people. So there's actually been a large supply of meat on the market. As we kind of work through that supply, there's a much grimmer outlook on the other end of that, because once the overstocked supply of pigs that are being slaughtered diminish, then we're going to see an enormous uptick in the price of things like beef and chicken. Chicken started to kind of rebound a little bit recently. All of these meat prices are going to skyrocket over the next 12 months. Even if they had African swine fever completely contained a month from now, the actual peak in the supply glut that it's caused, we won't see for many, many months to come. And that's what's so scary about African swine fever and the meat market right now. But you have meat going up, you have dairy going up, you have vegetable oils going up. Grains have been kind of steady, but everybody thinks that they're going to go up. One of the big things that you read about with grains and corn is the amount of corn that's been left into the fields. The USDA is going to categorize all of the corn out in the fields as on-farm storage, which means that they're going to include it in their crop reports as harvested crops on-farm storage. Now, the problem is that, yes, you can harvest, you can leave that out in the fields and you can harvest it in the spring, but typically you'll lose anywhere between 10-15% of the yield of those crops, and there's a large number of crops that are left out in the fields. When it comes to corn, the USDA released its final report of the season, 92% harvested, which means that you've got 8% of the corn unharvested. Not even 50%, like 47% of North Dakota's corn was harvested. 74% of Wisconsin's corn was harvested. If you look at how many states across the country were below harvest records or harvest averages at the end of the season, it's quite a bit. There's quite a bit of corn that was left out in the fields, and it just doesn't look good. If we have a harsh winter, you can expect more than a 10 to 15% loss in yields from that corn being left out in the fields, but there's just no way to get it off. The other problem here that I see is that when you have 8% of the fields unharvested, left unharvested, and we have a bad spring, that's the big question, and it's looking more and more likely if you go off of astrological records and then you compare it to years where we've seen similar type of events and similar type of patterns, we're going to have a cold, wet spring again. It's probably going to be worse than the 2019 spring, and that's just from the historical records that I've seen. Now, there are a lot of things that affect climate and weather patterns, so that could change. I mean, what I'm explaining to you is just what historically would be the norm for these type of events, but that doesn't mean that something else couldn't occur. I mean, heck, a volcano could go off at any time and put us into a dark winter. With these fields that are behind, if we have a shorter planting time in the spring, now you've got to harvest those crops before you can till the fields and prepare them to put the new crop in the ground. So 2020 is definitely already, we're already starting off on the wrong foot for 2020 by having that many crops. 8% of our crops are still out in the fields for the winter. That is not a good thing, and that is not a good way to start out the spring. Everybody knows this. I think everybody's been thinking about it. You hear about farmers in the East holding on to their grains. This is why, because farmers know there's way too much still out there. We're going to start off the year 8% is going to be unplanted most likely, because it's going to be too quick of a time frame for planting to be able to clear those fields, harvest what's out there, prepare the fields for the next season, and put them in the ground. The other option is that they could just wipe those crops off the books. And that's where I think you're going to have to watch the September report when they make their adjustments to the 2019 growing season. You're going to see how many of those crops just completely get gutted and they start fresh, because otherwise they're not going to have time to plant for the new season. And that's a choice that farmers are going to have to make. They've got corn out in the field. It might be lower on yields. Do they go out and they harvest that corn and risk not being able to plant the next year's corn on time? It's a tough business. That's something that I think, you know, for the upper plains and Midwest farmers, that is a tough choice that they're going to have to make in the spring, and it's going to really hurt some people if they make the wrong choice. And that's a gamble. I couldn't tell you which way to go with it, because if it is a tough spring and we get another late planting, you might end up being in the same position you were this year next year, because who knows what next fall is going to look like. You know, I'm not going to give my predictions this far out, but you know, if the patterns continue, if the solar minimum continues, you could have an early winter next fall. So you know, taking that gamble might not be worth it. It's a tough call. The other thing is that those plants that are left out in the fields, they're already facing yield issues because they matured later. It's taken longer for those crops to dry out. That's part of the reason why they were left in the fields. The other reason is because the fields are getting too wet. We've been hit with a lot of storms. North Dakota is a prime example. I don't know exactly how farmers are going to choose to solve that issue, but it is a big issue, and it's one that they're going to have to face going into 2020, early 2020. It's a decision that's going to have to be made. Do we try and get the crops off? Do we figure out a way to just start over? Either way, you got to go in and do field work. So they'll probably try and harvest what's there and then do the field work, and then try and, you know, get back and put new crops in the ground. It's just going to be, you know, a fire drill like we've never seen before. And like I said, if the minimum continues, which everybody thinks it will, we could see an early winter again next fall. So we'll be facing a similar issue. This is becoming the norm. Finally got this thing moving the way I want it. This thing is annoying. The guys working with me broke this guard. Now it just doesn't even work. There we go. I'm actually building some pantries in our house. I'll do a video on that for you guys. I don't do how-to videos anymore because realistically, I really don't know how to do this stuff. It's just, you know, when you are like us and you live out on a farm or you're a homesteader, you tend to start to do things on your own and you learn as you go. I used to do videos explaining how to, but then so many of our viewers remind me that I don't know what I'm doing, and that's fine. I had fun learning, but I no longer do how-to videos. Sometimes I do project videos just to show you guys what I'm doing, but I don't try and explain it anymore because I'm still learning myself. I have fun doing it. So I used to trade metals years ago, and something that caught my interest on metals is that the yields that we get from mines have dropped. So if you could find a company that was sitting on a good mine asset, you could make a lot of money. I'd buy the options when I thought maybe they were close to a discovery, and if they got something, you could make a ton of money off of the options of that, because we basically have reached a point with metals that is where the consumption of metals, our uses of metals, have exceeded the volume in which we're able to discover new metals. So you call that peak production. That means that we're no longer discovering large stockpiles of metals that we can mine and extract, and we're no longer mining out and producing as much as we used to. So the curve of production has started to decline, while because of population and because of new technologies, all these people wanting solar panels and things like that, our uses of these things have gone through the roof. And so we're at a point where your production supply is constantly becoming less than the demand. The discovery of new oil, we just haven't had a whole lot of new discovery. Nothing that is going to help offset the demand of oil. And nothing that's going to offset the demand of metal. And the bulk of what we've found is much smaller than what we've found before. So we've passed peak production in both of those. And so you can expect that the price index of things like oils and metals and stuff like that to continue to go up. And that's also going to affect fertilizer. So basically the same minerals and things that we have to mine to put into metals and oil and things like that. Well, when you look at fertilizers and things that we need to be able to grow plants, everybody thinks that growing plants and GMOs are going to save the world, but we need fertilizers to make those things work. We need pesticides and things to make those work. Well, those are becoming more and more expensive rapidly as well because of the same phenomenon. Please excuse me as a rice burner goes by. It's always a Toyota or something that they make to sound like, something that should be in the Indy 500. Anyway, so we've kind of reached peak production in things like fertilizers as well, the chemicals used in fertilizers. So the prices of those are going to go higher and higher. And GMOs haven't really been able to, they've caused more problems than they've solved. And even though we're expecting a new corn to come out that's supposed to increase yields 10%, the cost of the food is still going to go up because the fertilizers, the things that we need to be able to grow that food, have passed peak production. Crop yields have crossed peak production. And by that I mean our ability to increase crop yields compared to the consumption of crops, the consumption of what we grow, have already crossed. Our consumption patterns are going much higher than our ability to increase yields. We went through a period of time where we increased yields dramatically, and then our ability to continue to increase has slowly stepped down. It's been a stepping down process. So just with the natural course of things, just with our natural ability to produce, to sustain our population, we've already crossed the mark of sustainability. We've already surpassed it dramatically, and prices are starting to go up. So when you put all this information together, and like I said, there are people out there who are going to argue there's plenty of oil in the world. Technically fracking kind of went out of business here in the US for quite some time because the problem is that it was still cheaper to pull crude out of the desert than it was to frack, and so you couldn't compete with prices. And so there are some supplies. In order to get to the point of extracting those resources, prices have to go higher, and that's ultimately where we're heading. We're ultimately heading to much higher prices. When you adjust the food index to account for inflation and everything else, when our food index gets much above 200, right now I think it's at 177, might be close to 180. What happens is once it gets up over 200 is that you have a lot of social unrest. You have a lot of people start to break out and fight. I mean, if you look at history, whenever we get a food price index that gets too high, people become desperate and they take drastic measures. And societies fall apart, governments fall apart, kingdoms fall apart. That is the reality of the food becoming too expensive. It has happened throughout history, but the difference is that this time when it happens, there is no reverting back. We have had, it'll be of epic proportions in my opinion. It'll be biblical. So everything is about to pop. If you think that a 26% rise in palm oil was bad, just wait until meat prices next year. Every single thing on the food index, from meat to dairy because of cattle farmers going bankrupt, meat because of African swine fever, which we won't even see the effects of that until about 10 or 12 months from now. Grains, we'll probably see corn over $6 after we get a September correction in our reports from this year. If we have a late planting in the spring, that's going to drive corn much higher. We've already seen wheat moving higher. We've already seen soybeans moving higher. The vegetable oil industry, like I said, that's kind of one of those things where it's not just a growing issue, but it's a political issue, it's a biofuel issue. All of these things are going to push prices higher. And biofuels are not going away because we have crossed peak oil production. The problem is that our resource to replace it, biofuels, replacing crude oil, is that we've also passed peak yield increases in crops. We're unable to produce crops with growing yields at the same rate we were before. It's been slowly declining. Our ability to do that has been going down. Fertilizer prices are going up. All of this points to a food index score of over 200 in our very near future, and I think it could go the highest we've seen it in at least 100 years. The social unrest when that happens will be incredible. The only way you could possibly protect yourself in this scenario, rising fuel, rising energy, rising food all at one time. Sorry, I'm waving my pencil, aren't I? I feel like a teacher. But the only way that you can possibly prevent this is to put yourself in a position now where you're putting that stuff into storage, where you're creating a buffer, because the shock wave that comes with it is going to be severe. Our population has grown exceedingly. It is unsustainable. These charts, these numbers show you how unsustainable it is. I don't disagree with people that say that we are overpopulated. What I disagree with are people who say that we need to control the population. We need to choose who lives, who dies, who's born, who's not. I disagree with that. I completely agree with natural selection. I completely agree with nature taking its course, there being correction in populations. This is stuff that has happened throughout history. It's happened again and again and again. Population exceeds its sustainability and things happen. Population drops, population moves forward, new technologies. It's a never-ending cycle, and it's happened. If you read the Bible, it happened throughout the Bible. People were warned, people were guided, they were fine. But it is an event that is right around the corner. It's been around the corner. The grand solar minimum and all the talk about the grand solar minimum only intensifies it tenfold. So we were already heading to a catastrophic price increase of cost of energy, cost of food. Now, with a grand solar minimum event, we're getting there 10 times faster because we're unable to, the yields are dropping even faster. We're using way too much for biofuels. Is a disaster, really, if you think about it. It's one that we have known about for quite some time. Everybody ignores the signs on every side. And then we get to the point where all of a sudden the weather patterns change and we go, oh shoot, now what do we do? Everybody says grow indoors. Well, the problem is that if you lose electricity, if you have a geomagnetic event, you're relying on another unreliable resource. You need to move into greenhouses. You need to start using natural sources of fertilizer. You need to start thinking more sustainable without the need of all the technologies, without the need of all of those things, because they are running out. I told my wife earlier this year that there will be a time in our kids' lives when driving a car, whether it's electric or it's gas-fueled, is going to be entirely uneconomical to them. It's not going to make any sense. And I believe that because the metals and the things that we have to mine for all these energy efficient technologies are in the same position as the oil supply that we have on our planet. We are past peak production. We are past peak mining. We are past the peak in all of it. It was a very, very short part of global history that we had those resources, and we blew them all like somebody going on a Black Friday sale. I don't agree with climate change the man-made global warming agenda. I think the whole thing is a scam, and they're using these events to scare people into following them. The reality is not even the things that they're doing, the GMOs, the, solar panels, sustainable electricity, uranium, things like that. All of it is just as unsustainable as the last thing. The only thing that is truly sustainable is when you have a population of people who can go out, who can tend to themselves, tend to their own land, and survive on their own. But governments don't want that, because if they have that, you stop depending on their currency, the tax system fails, the government fails. And that is why when you look at these charts, there's so many disruptions. Because when people get desperate, when people have to go out and actually do things for themselves, that's what happens. And here's the thing, when we talk about this stuff, I'm not talking about, the end of mankind. I'm not talking about the end of governments and civilization. What I'm talking about is a dramatic change in everything that we do. And if you pay attention to it, you could be prepared to put yourself in a position where you will be ahead of the game. But there is generally, when these things happen, there is a push for socialism, a push for democracy in a scale that is much different than we're used to. And that's not necessarily a beneficial thing. What that is that those are people in need of resources wanting a society that provides them with resources, because that's what they have become addicted to. That's what they have always had. The Grand Solar Minimum event is just taking those weaknesses and amplifying them. It's going to happen faster. It's actually probably a good thing, because it won't be a slow crawl into a corner like we have been. Everybody's been complaining about the economy for the last 15 years, but when you look at these indexes, when you look at these prices, that's part of the reason why prices have been climbing. We have been artificially keeping food prices low. We've been manipulating grain prices, manipulating pricing for quite some time to make everything else affordable, so that people don't realize that the cost of goods and services, the costs of energy, is far exceeding anything that we could ever expect it to. If you look at the price of oil, for 100 years almost, the base price was around $15 a barrel. Then, when I was in college, when I was growing up, maybe it was $35 a barrel. Over the last 10 years, it's been up around $75 a barrel. And that's the base. That's the average price per barrel of oil. Prices are going through the roof on energy. They're going through the roof on food. It's going to cause social revolutions. It's going to cause society changes. And in my opinion, the food supply is going to eventually affect our ability to continue to sustain the population that we have. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't naturally regress in a harmonious way, but it does mean that there are changes ahead, and that's what I think is important for everybody to recognize.